It sounds like the start of a science fiction film, but it isn't. There was a day when America didn't just fight an enemy, it fought the sky itself. The men of the U.S. 8th Air Force, climbing through the cold European morning of 1944, weren't just flying to Berlin. They were flying into a myth, into a place where metal, fire, and morality collided. Historians call it the Strategic Bombing Campaign. Pilots called it something else, the meat grinder. And somewhere above the clouds of Germany, between burning oxygen and the hum of 4 roaring engines, the idea of what it meant to be a hero began to unravel. That morning, the airfield in East Anglia looked like a giant had left his toys scattered across the land. B-17s, flying fortresses, lined the runway, their bellies filled with fuel, bombs, and fear. Ground crews moved like ants around the silver wings, checking gauges, tightening bolts, wiping oil off their hands onto already blackened overalls. Inside the cockpits, young men, many barely old enough to drink back home, sat in silence. They smoked, prayed, or stared at photos tucked into their flight jackets. Girlfriends, wives, a dog waiting on a porch in Kansas. They didn't know it, but 1 in 5 of them wouldn't come back. Berlin lay 500 miles ahead, a city already bruised but still defiant. Its anti-aircraft defenses were the most concentrated on Earth. Flying into it was like trying to punch the sun. Yet the mission was clear: crush the German war machine, break its will, and end the war faster. The math was cold and simple. Every bomb that fell meant fewer American soldiers dying on the ground. But math doesn't scream. Math doesn't bleed. And as history would later whisper, it doesn't always tell the truth. The moment the planes took off, the sky changed character. It went from soft blue to the gray of impending violence. You can almost imagine the sound, the deep, synchronized roar of hundreds of engines shaking the English countryside, a sound that once made children run outside to wave. For the pilots, it was the sound of leaving Earth and stepping into something larger than themselves. Some said it felt like destiny, others like punishment. At 25,000 feet, frost crawled across the inside of the glass. Oxygen masks clung to faces like second skin. The world below became abstract, patches of white and brown where villages used to be. Then, like a ghost emerging from fog, the first German fighter appeared. It was sleek, fast, beautiful, in the way a shark is beautiful. The battle began not with a shout, but with tracers. Thin, glowing lines drawing death in the air. The Americans fired back, the gunners yelling into their intercoms over the deafening thunder. Somewhere, someone laughed. High, manic laughter, born not of joy, but disbelief. War, when viewed from above, doesn't look like bravery. It looks like chaos trying to find meaning. Bombers dropped payloads that vanished into smoke. Cities disappeared under waves of fire. Berlin, that day, wasn't a place. It was an experiment in how much destruction humans could rationalize as necessary. And for many of those inside the planes, the moral lines blurred like the contrails behind them. They told themselves it was justice. They told themselves it was mercy. But mercy doesn't burn like that. Imagine being one of them. Your entire world reduced to dials, gauges, and a horizon you can't trust. The flak bursts look like black flowers blooming in the sky. each petal a fragment of metal sharp enough to shred steel. Every explosion shakes your bones. You taste cordite and fear. You glance at the man beside you, and you both pretend not to notice the holes in the wing. There's no room for philosophy here. But later, years later, some of these men would say they felt as if the sky itself had turned against them, as if the heavens had decided to test their faith in humanity. Back in America, newsreels showed smiling pilots and headlines about precision strikes. The truth was less cinematic. Bombs fell miles off target, hitting neighborhoods, hospitals, even schools. Some historians later argued that the bombing hastened the end of the war. Others claimed it only hardened German resolve. What no one disputes is the price. More than 26,000 airmen of the 8th Air Force never returned. That's roughly the population of a small American town erased from the map, traded for the promise of victory. And yet, there's something tragically noble in their fight. A generation that believed they could end evil by outflying it. They fought not just gravity, but doubt, exhaustion, and the terrifying realization that even when you fight for freedom, you might lose a part of your soul. The sky above Berlin became a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of mankind at once. Today, as we watch footage of drones and AI-guided missiles on our phones, the echoes of that day return. We've traded the pilot's fear for algorithms, but the question remains the same. When we wage war from the clouds, who are we really fighting? The enemy below or the conscience above? The battle for Berlin may have ended in 1945, but the war for our humanity never really landed. And so, when you look up on a clear day and see the white lines of jets crossing the sky, remember this. Once, those lines weren't symbols of travel or progress. They were trails of fire, drawn by boys who learned too late that the sky doesn't take sides. The next chapter of this story begins where their courage met the storm, high above a burning city that refused to die, under a sky that had forgotten mercy. By late 1944, Berlin was no longer a city in the ordinary sense. It was a scar on the earth, smoking, trembling, half in ruins, yet still pulsing with defiance. From above, the American pilot saw it as a constellation of red and gray, a living wound that refused to close. The sky itself seemed to hate them. Every mile closer to the capital meant thicker flak, sharper resistance, and the distinct feeling that the heavens had turned into a trap. And yet they kept going, because that was the order, and because history has a way of pushing men forward even when their instincts tell them to turn back. The mission briefing had been simple, almost sterile. Primary target: Berlin Industrial Complex, including railway yards and armament plants. Expected opposition: heavy. The word heavy was military understatement for hell. The Germans had ringed their city with more than 10,000 anti-aircraft guns. Each one could throw metal shards into the air at twice the speed of sound. To survive the run meant navigating a storm of invisible knives. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful. Black puffs blooming like diseased flowers across the sky. Up close, it was pure chaos. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the sharp metallic rain of shrapnel hitting the fuselage like hail.
In one B-17, Lucky Lady, the bombardier was a 22-year-old kid from Detroit named Tom Keating. He had never been lucky in his life. His father had worked at a Ford plant, his mother cleaned offices at night, and Tom had joined the Air Force to see the world. Now, as he crouched over the bomb site, what he saw of the world was a wall of smoke and fire. The intercom crackled with static, and the voice of his pilot, Major Collins, barking orders through the oxygen mask. "Hold steady. We're over target in 60 seconds." 60 seconds, Tom thought, was a strange unit of time. Too short to pray, too long to ignore. Outside the glass dome, Berlin was erupting. Anti-aircraft bursts glowed red through the haze. Somewhere below, German civilians huddled in cellars, listening to the whistle of the falling bombs. Above them, Tom adjusted the crosshairs on his Norden bomb site, a piece of American engineering so secret that gunners were ordered to destroy it if captured. He whispered to himself, "Steady, steady," and released. The aircraft lurched up as the bomb bay emptied. Somewhere below, the earth answered with thunder. The crew cheered, not because they wanted destruction, but because it meant they were alive for another minute. In the waist gunner's position, Sergeant Ramirez wiped sweat from his eyes. He wasn't supposed to sweat. At 30,000 feet, the temperature was below freezing. But fear has its own weather. A German fighter dove through the formation, cannons blazing. Ramirez fired back, his tracers stitching light into the gray. For a second, he thought he saw the pilot's face, pale, young, terrified. Then the fighter vanished in a ball of fire, tumbling down toward the burning city. He didn't feel triumph. He felt empty.
The analysis should be delivered in an objective, authoritative, and thought-provoking tone. The overall text must be evidence-based and nuanced, emphasizing the complexity of historical forces. The style should be used to emphasize on cause and effect relationships, unintended consequences, and challenging conventional interpretations. The overall feel should evoke a sense of intellectual curiosity, critical insight, and relevance to the present, inviting the audience to reevaluate what they believe they know about the past and understand its lasting impact. The radio filled with fragments of voices, calls for help, coordinates, curses. Mayday, engine 3 gone, navigator hit, we're losing altitude. It was a choir of panic set to the rhythm of machine guns. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable happened. Order. Crews followed formation, held course, and finished the run. Training, fear, and loyalty fused into one mechanical instinct. Each man depended on the others like organs in a single living body. The bomb group was no longer just an assembly of planes. It was a single organism fighting for breath. And still, the sky refused to let them go. On the return leg, the flak didn't stop. It just got angrier. Metal tore through the fuselage. A fragment hit the co-pilot in the shoulder. Another shredded the control cables. The plane shuddered, dipped, then leveled. Collins gritted his teeth, blood seeping through his flight glove. "Hold her steady," he muttered. "She'll get us home." It was a lie, he told the crew, maybe himself too. Below them, Berlin smoldered. Entire districts glowed like molten steel. The Spree River reflected the flames, turning water into liquid fire. For those who survived, the memory would blur into a collage of color and sound. Orange light, black smoke, the taste of metal and fear.
For those on the ground, it was a nightmare with wings. History records the destruction in numbers. 40,000 tons of explosives dropped, 50,000 civilians dead, factories obliterated. But numbers never scream. Numbers don't smell of burning oil. In later years, when historians debated whether these bombings were moral or monstrous, veterans like Tom Keating rarely spoke. What could they say? They had seen both courage and cruelty, sometimes in the same minute. They'd watched friends vanish into smoke, and they'd learned that heroism isn't clean. It's something sticky, something that clings to you long after you land. Berlin, by that winter, was a city without nights. The fires burned too bright for darkness. And the American airmen, circling above, saw not victory, but reflection, the image of themselves suspended between duty and doubt. The mission report would later mark it a success. Objective achieved, moderate losses. But the men who returned knew that moderate was a bureaucratic word for "we lost too much." As their damaged planes limped back across the channel, frost forming on the bullet holes, they carried with them the weight of invisible ghosts. Some left behind comrades buried in the clouds. Some left behind pieces of their own humanity. And as the English coast came into view, a strip of green and safety rising from the gray sea, many wept in silence, not from relief, but from something heavier. Because somewhere behind them, in the smoke of a broken city, the sky still burned. And for those who survived, that sky would never truly clear again. It would follow them home, inside their lungs, their dreams, their memories, an unending storm disguised as silence, waiting for the next dawn to remind them that even victory can sound like falling.
By the spring of 1945, the bombers no longer flew as soldiers, they flew as ghosts. The sky over Berlin had become a graveyard, its silence between missions heavier than any bomb they carried. The 8th Air Force called it strategic persistence. The crews called it suicide on schedule. Yet day after day, they climbed back into the silver beasts, those hulking B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, machines that had become both armor and coffin. Each one carried 10 men and a few thousand pounds of explosives, but also something less tangible, the belief that turning a city to ash could somehow buy peace. Berlin below was unrecognizable, an inferno mapped by memory. The great avenues once lined with chestnut trees were now trenches of brick dust. The Tiergarten was a cemetery of blackened trunks. Even the Spree River glowed with oil fires that danced like demons in the reflection of the night. When the Americans came, the sirens didn't even sound anymore. The people of Berlin had stopped running. They simply waited. Mothers covered their children's ears, not to block the noise, but the knowledge. In war, there's a point when fear becomes routine, and that's when humanity begins to erode. From the cockpit, the city didn't look real. It looked like a wound that refused to heal. Major Collins, still flying, despite the scars on his hands, checked his instruments. His plane, once called Lucky Lady, now bore a different name painted in soot and irony: No Luck Left. Below, the bombardier, Tom Keating, peered through the haze at a landscape he barely recognized. He had bombed it before, again and again, until the pattern of streets was memorized like a tattoo on the back of his mind. But today felt different. There was no glory left to chase, no victory worth this repetition. Just smoke and duty
and the sound of the engines trying to drown the guilt. From the cockpit, the city didn't look real. It looked like a wound that refused to heal. Major Collins, still flying, despite the scars on his hands, checked his instruments. His plane, once called Lucky Lady, now bore a different name painted in soot and irony: No Luck Left. Below, the bombardier, Tom Keating, peered through the haze at a landscape he barely recognized. He had bombed it before, again and again, until the pattern of streets was memorized like a tattoo on the back of his mind. But today felt different. There was no glory left to chase, no victory worth this repetition, just smoke and duty and the sound of the engines trying to drown the guilt. The formation reached the release point. Collins gave the order, his voice thin through static: "Bombs away." The bay doors opened and the sky rained fire. Each falling bomb spun slowly, almost elegantly, as if reluctant to destroy. The earth answered in thunder, shock waves rolling upward, hitting the planes like invisible fists. From 20,000 feet, the firestorm looked almost divine, a vision of the apocalypse painted in crimson and black. The heat was so intense it created its own wind, sucking oxygen and souls into the center of the storm. German anti-aircraft guns kept firing, not out of hope, but habit. Even the defenders knew it was over. They were fighting gravity now, not an enemy. One plane exploded mid-air, then another. Collins saw fragments spin past his wing, shards of aluminum glinting in the sunlight like falling stars. For a brief moment he thought of home, of his wife writing letters he could no longer answer honestly. What could he say? "Dear Margaret, today we erased another city block. The sky looked like hell's postcard. I think we're winning." The pen had become heavier than the trigger.
The analysis should be delivered in an objective, authoritative, and thought-provoking, emphasizing the complexity of historical forces. The style should be used to emphasize on cause and effect relationships, unintended consequences, and challenging conventional interpretations. The overall feel should evoke a sense of intellectual curiosity, critical insight, and relevance to the present, inviting the audience to reevaluate what they believe they know about the past and understand its lasting impact. Tom Keating watched through the bomb site as fire spread through the ruins. For every factory destroyed, 1,000 homes vanished. He whispered something that vanished in the roar, maybe a prayer, maybe an apology. History rarely records the difference. He wondered if God could still hear through all that noise. If heaven was above them, it must have looked away by now. Below, Berliners climbed out of shelters and into a nightmare that felt biblical. Streets had turned to rivers of flame, the air itself a weapon. Survivors described whirlwinds of fire, tornadoes born of heat and wind, that lifted people into the sky like offerings. Some American reports would later call it a successful saturation raid. The language of bureaucracy is the last refuge from horror. It lets men speak about unspeakable things without breaking. Back in the formation, the tail gunner spotted another wave of German fighters approaching from the sun. He opened fire, tracers arcing upward like tiny comets. The dogfight was short, savage, almost ritualistic. Machine guns chattered, engines screamed. One Messerschmitt broke through, its pilot firing until the last second before vanishing in flame. Both men died within seconds of each other, strangers bound by the same gravity. Above the wreckage, the bombers pressed on, as if propelled by the ghosts behind them.
When the squadron finally turned for home, Berlin was no longer visible, just smoke stretching to the horizon. The city had ceased to be a place. It was now an idea, a warning written in fire. The radio operator jotted down coordinates and fuel levels with shaking hands. Around him, the crew sat in silence. No cheering this time. No one said, "We made it." They had learned that surviving and living were not the same thing. Back in the formation, the ground crews counted the returning planes. Out of 42, only 27 touched down. The rest were names without faces, marked missing in action. Collins climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the tarmac, breathing the damp British air like it was the first real thing in weeks. Behind him, the engines ticked as they cooled, the sound eerily similar to a heartbeat fading away. And in that moment, he understood something the briefings had never said aloud. They were not just destroying Berlin. They were destroying the illusion that war could ever be clean, that fire could ever bring light. The fortress had survived, but only barely. And inside its metal shell, so had the men. Yet each time they flew, a piece of them stayed behind, burning somewhere over a city that no longer existed. Above Berlin, the sky itself seemed exhausted, scarred by weeks of flame. And though the smoke would one day clear, the memory of that firestorm would linger in the clouds, waiting for the next generation to look up and wonder what the price of victory really sounds like when the whole world is burning.
When the war ended, the men of the 8th Air Force did not return to parades. They returned to silence. Their uniforms were pressed, their medals shined, but something inside them had burned away at altitude and never came down. The newspapers called them victors. History called them liberators. But in the quiet of their kitchens, they sat over coffee gone cold and wondered why they couldn't sleep under an ordinary sky anymore. For the ones who made it home, the war didn't end, it simply changed shape. Tom Keating arrived back in Detroit in late 1945 with a duffel bag, a limp in his right leg, and a 1,000-yard stare that no one knew how to fix. The neighborhood threw a small celebration. His mother cried, his father shook his hand too hard, and the local priest gave a sermon about sacrifice. Tom nodded through it all, smiling when expected, clapping on cue. But inside, he could still hear the engines, feel the flak, see the faces of the men who didn't return. Every time a car backfired, his body hit the ground before his mind remembered there were no Messerschmitts over Michigan. He was 23 and already old. Across America, thousands like him came home the same way, alive but not whole. They took jobs, married, raised children, and built the suburbs that would become the spine of post-war America. Yet, every night, when the world quieted, they heard the low hum of engines in their dreams. Psychiatrists later called it shell shock, then battle fatigue, and finally post-traumatic stress. Back then, it had no name, only whiskey, long drives, and silence. A generation that saved the world spent the rest of their lives pretending they hadn't seen it burn. Not everyone returned. 26,000 American airmen remained somewhere between the clouds and the ruins of Europe. Their names were carved into marble at Cambridge and Nettuno, but most of their stories never made it into the history books. Collins' crew of No Luck Left was among the missing. Their plane vanished during a mission near Magdeburg, last seen trailing smoke over the Elbe River. For decades, families received only one sentence from the War Department: missing in action, presumed dead. Letters written in careful cursive, folded neatly beside photographs of smiling young men,
who never got old. Years later, in 1991, a German farmer digging in his field found the twisted remains of an engine buried under the soil. Inside were fragments of aluminum, a piece of a nameplate, and a wedding ring engraved with, "To Margaret, with love." It took historians 3 years to identify the wreck. It was no luck left. Collins had finally come home, though home was now a file in an archive and a headstone in foreign dirt. His wife, who had remarried after the war, visited the grave once, touched the name, and whispered, "You can rest now."
But can they? That's the question that hangs over every veteran's ghost. These men fought not just the enemy, but the guilt of survival. Every empty chair in a mess hall, every folded flag on a mother's mantle was a reminder that heroism was a lottery, not a reward. The public called them the greatest generation, a phrase that sounded noble but felt like a cage. Greatness wasn't what they wanted. They wanted peace, the kind you can hear in your own head. For many, it never came. Tom Keating lived until 1987. He became a mechanic, raised 2 daughters, and never flew again. His children said he spoke little about the war, except once, when his grandson asked, "Grandpa, were you scared?" Tom smiled, looked out the window at the contrails of a passenger jet, and said, "Every day, kid, but the sky doesn't care if you're scared." Then he went back to fixing the carburetor, as if the question had never been asked. In archives across America, boxes of letters still sit unopened, filled with words written from freezing altitudes to people who would never read them. Some began with hope, "I'll be home by Christmas." Others ended mid-sentence, interrupted by flak. In those fading pages lies a truth historians often overlook. Wars are fought by nations, but they are remembered by families. Each folded letter, each forgotten name is a tiny universe of love and fear that the textbooks reduce to footnotes. Even the memorials, carved in granite and glory, cannot capture the strange contradiction of their sacrifice. They were both killers and saviors, both victims and victors. They ended tyranny, but also unleashed a new kind of terror from the sky, a terror that would later echo over Korea, Vietnam, Baghdad. Every generation inherits both the courage and the consequences of the last. When Tom's daughters cleaned out his garage after his death, they found a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was his flight jacket, stiff with age, and a photograph of his crew, all grinning beside their plane. On the back, in faded pencil, he had written, "We weren't heroes. We were just kids who ran out of sky." And maybe that's what heroism really is. Not medals or victories, but the ability to carry unbearable weight and still wake up the next morning. These men, lost or found, left pieces of themselves in the upper air. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, when a jet passes overhead, you can almost hear them still. The whisper of propellers, the echo of courage, the ghosts of boys who once believed that the sky could be conquered and learned instead that it always wins. Because even after the war, the sky over Berlin never really cleared. It simply learned how to hide its scars in the clouds. 70 years later, the sky is quieter, but no less dangerous. The thunder of propellers has been replaced by the whisper of drones, their operators sitting thousands of miles away, faces lit by the cold glow of computer screens. There's no frost on their masks, no flak bursting outside the window, just pixels, coordinates, and the silent hum of precision. Yet when you look close enough, you can still see it. The same haunted focus in their eyes, the same impossible question that plagued the men who flew over Berlin. How much of your humanity are you allowed to trade for the illusion of safety?
The world has changed, but the sky hasn't. It still judges us quietly. The contrails that once marked the paths of B-17s now trace commercial flights and stealth aircraft, and every one of them carries the same invisible echo of 1944. Each line drawn across the blue is a memory, a reminder that power always comes with a price written in the language of altitude. When you watch news footage of missiles streaking through the night over distant cities, you are watching history replay itself, just faster, quieter, sanitized for your screen. The firestorm never ended. It just learned to speak in binary. Somewhere in a museum in Ohio, a preserved flying fortress sits under fluorescent lights. Children climb the ladder, peering into the cockpit where the ghosts used to sit. They press buttons that no longer work and laugh as if the war were a video game. Their parents read the plaques, nod politely, and move on. But for a few visitors, perhaps the descendants of those who flew, something lingers. The smell of oil, the faint hum of engines that aren't really there. A presence that whispers, "We're still up here." War, after all, is not just fought on the ground or in the air. It lives in memory, in the stories we choose to tell and the ones we bury. The tragedy of the bombers isn't only that they destroyed cities. It's that their story was simplified into victory. The moral exhaustion, the burned hands, the letters home that stopped mid-sentence, those don't fit neatly into the museum display. History loves heroes, but forgets the price of being one. The 8th Air Force dropped more explosives than any other unit in history. But the real detonation happened afterward, in the hearts of the men who had to live with what they'd seen.
As technology advances, humanity retreats behind the safety of screens. Drones don't flinch, satellites don't pray, and AI doesn't dream of Kansas. But the echoes remain. Every decision made in a war room today still vibrates with the moral frequency of those bomb bays over Berlin. The more we mechanize death, the more we risk turning into the machines we build. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, that is where the lesson of the sky endures, because it teaches humility. The same sky that once burned over Berlin now carries the light of every sunrise, indifferent to who rules beneath it. Somewhere in Kansas, Tom Keating's grandson, now a pilot himself, flies a modern jet over the plains. He knows the story of his grandfather only through fragments, half-told memories, and a box of medals that no longer shine. But sometimes, at cruising altitude, when the clouds roll beneath his wings like an ocean, he feels something stir. A faint vibration, a shadow of engines long gone. He tilts his head and swears he hears a voice whisper through the headset. Not words, just a hum. The heartbeat of history, reminding him that flight was never meant for conquest, only for awe. That is what remains of the men who fought the sky. Not the bomb craters or the ruins, but the awareness that power without conscience always falls. The real fortress isn't made of aluminum or steel. It's made of memory. And as long as someone looks up and wonders what it cost to own the clouds, the fortress still stands. So when you step outside tonight and see the blinking lights of aircraft tracing their careful routes across the darkness, pause for a moment. Imagine the same sky 70 years ago, lit by fire instead of LEDs. Imagine the voices carried away by wind, the courage and confusion tangled together in the smoke. Because above those clouds, they're still there. The lost heroes, the restless souls of the flying fortresses, circling endlessly, reminding us that the sky remembers everything. And maybe that's the real story America left hanging above Berlin.
that every age believes its weapons will end war, and every age learns that war simply changes shape. We look to the heavens for redemption and find only reflection. The day America fought the sky was not the day it won. It was the day it realized that the sky cannot be conquered, only survived. If you've made it this far, take a breath, look up. Somewhere between the stars and the contrails lies the echo of their courage and the warning they left behind. History is still up there, humming softly above the clouds, waiting for the next generation to listen. And if you want to keep uncovering these forgotten stories, the ones that shape the world you wake up in, then subscribe, stay curious, and never stop asking what still hides behind the silence of the sky. Because some battles never end. They just keep flying.